www.glacialforest.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
Oh my mic was muted. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio with the shortest intro bumper on the internet. You're muted.
You've got the wrong mic on again.
Oh dear.
You sound like you're underwater.
How did we fix this?
Go to settings.
Got it.
Audio, video, and then it'll give you an option to change your mic to the fine.
Okay, sorry about this. Bear with us.
Pardon our technical difficulties yet again.
Okay, microphone.
Fine. FIFA
Much better.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a great show. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. My lovely co-host, Leah Shaper, has amazing earrings. We are part of the fringe minority.
Yes, I'm celebrating the inauguration a little bit early.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it's going to be a spicy day tomorrow, but Waxing Monday. But before we get to the inauguration, we're going to be talking about a new discovery in Wyoming. They found a 6,000-year-old buried forest that is way above tree line, and we'll get into the climatology of that because the title of the show is Ancient Buried Forests and what they tell us about past climate. We're going to be discussing a 1,000-year-old site in Alaska at the Mendenhall Glacier. We're going to be discussing the 6,000-year-old forest in Wyoming. We will then, in the second half of the show, dive a little deeper and go a little older to a younger Dryas time period forest buried in Wisconsin, followed up by a submerged Ice Age forest in Alabama. Mm-hmm. Pretty fantastic. And the Alabama forest is now being preserved because there are lots of, let's say, greedy interests that want to mine the area for the cypress and use the wood to sell products like 50,000-year-old coffee tables for $1 million.
Oh, wow.
So they're trying to protect that area. Anything you want to share before we dive in?
No, but I am getting a little bit of an echo.
All righty. Let's see if that helps.
Probably
well, we're looking at the area in question that was just uncovered in Wyoming. And what it shows is some white pines that when they carbon dated them and then they cross-checked it with tree ring data, they got some 6,000-year-old trees. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the area. So a 5,900-year-old white bark pine forest had been discovered due to melting alpine ice in the Rocky Mountains. Scientists found more than 30 trees, approximately 3,100 meters above sea level. And guys, if you don't know how high that is, up in Wyoming here, the further north you go in North America, tree line drops. The further south you go, tree line rises. That's because it's warmer, like, say, where we live, Leah and I, as compared to 800 miles to the north in Wyoming, where it's colder and tree line is much lower. So in this particular area, the actual tree line is 180 meters lower than where they found the trees. And that's quite a distance. That's about 600 feet of elevation. Now, in order for a forest to migrate that high,
again this week, which is very frustrating.
You're completely frozen, and I can't hear you at all.
You were just really frozen for me as well. Am I frozen for you right now?
Well, we're not frozen for anyone that's watching because last week we weren't frozen for anyone. So if we just can keep from talking over each other, that would probably just work.
It's sort of hard to know if I can't hear you. I don't know that I'm talking over you.
So this forest is 180 meters higher than any forest currently in Wyoming. And it existed just 5,900 years ago. So clearly what that shows us is that if we travel back in time just 6,000 years, it is going to be much warmer for an extended period of time, because it's going to take at least 1,000 years for a forest to migrate from its current position up 600 feet higher in elevation. You need a long-term continuous shift in climate to the warm.
And if I recall correctly, these particular trees existed for about 500 years. So that gives you also a little bit of perspective about the advance and retreat of glaciers and how and when these kinds of forests exist.
And that it took at least 500 years to get there. If they lasted for 500 years, I would think that the climate effect would be at least that long.
Right.
Because what we see is once the climate changes, in this case, there was a rapid cooling exactly at this time. We're going to look at the graph. That all that happened was this glacier, which is now retreating, at that particular time, it just advanced, crushed the forest, and preserved it continuously until today. So that means that we've been in a climate scenario that is much colder continuously for the last 6,000 years. And just now, it's warming up just enough to uncover this. So if the climate is warming, which it is, it has been for 150 years since the end of the last mini ice age. If it continues to, the temperature continues to rise at this rate, in 500 years or so, we may see forests back up here.
Yeah.
That's all it means.
Yes. It's very funny to read these articles because, like, every single media article about this kind of phenomena where, you know, forests are preserved under glaciers and then the glacier retreats and the forest is exposed. They, of course, point to anthropogenic global warming as the reason why we can see these forests now, while also acknowledging that their existence, in this case, 6,000 years ago, was due to a warmer climate. And yet, you know, despite the fact that this completely illustrates a totally natural phenomena, the warming and cooling of our climate, which means the advance and the retreat of glaciers, and this happens back and forth and back and forth. But now it has to be anthropogenic global warming that's allowing us to see these forests. It's really silly.
Yeah, well, we know that it's definitely warming.
Right.
But the fact that humans are causing it is anyone's guess. If we come take a look at the proxy data, the temperature anomaly data, and the modeled temperatures, it's going to reveal to you what's been going on here in academia. The green line, which you can't see in Radioville, is showing a slow increase in temperature since we came out of the ice age. And so the model temperatures, which are not real temperatures, they're based on their computer models that they want to show continuous warming, and then they want to show a spike in warming here that's caused by man. So the model temperatures that we have that scientists use do not correlate to the proxy temperatures. The proxy temperatures show a completely different picture. And the way scientists explain that away is that their models are more accurate than the proxies.
Why does this graph of proxy temperatures also show a giant spike at present? It's, I mean, because we don't need a proxy right now.
Where are you showing what spike?
Next to the red CO2 spike, you see the black line. That's the continuation of the proxy data.
Yeah, well, they're using the proxies to get that. So they're using the 018, 016 ratio that comes from glacial ice, which we use. It's a very high-tuned proxy for temperature. You can only get certain ratios at certain temperatures where they take the ice core. So you can assume that if we go back in the past and look at the 016, 18 ratio, that we're looking at the temperature. And so the temperature since the Little Ice Age has risen 1.5 C. We know that. And the proxies reflect that.
I mean, the good news is that you're using the same data set, you know, for that whole series, right? Because one of the problems that we have sometimes in data is pulling data from multiple places and sort of not calibrating them against each other. And then that's one of the ways you can kind of play with data and provide misleading information.
Right. Another interesting thing this graph reveals is that when we came out of the Ice Age, we rapidly warmed. It's estimated it could be 12 degrees or more. It took 4,000 years until the CO2 began to rise. after
Yeah.
the temperature rose. There was a
Yes.
4,000 year lag. Also a 6,000 year lag in CH4, methane.
Mhm.
So we can
I think
clearly
it's
see that CO2 and CH4 are not controlling the temperature. Even though they're
right.
greenhouse gases, they're in such small quantities. What they actually are is a reflection of temperature. So when
Right.
temperature rises, CO2 rises, but with a lag time.
I think it's also important to notice that, around after the 11,000 year mark, you see big temperature spikes happening in a short period of time that are just like what we see in the proxy data for the present, right? It's even though there's a big spike at present, that doesn't mean that it's not a natural phenomena because the data shows that that has happened in the past, long ago.
Yeah, you can even see them revealing here the medieval warm, which includes all of these spikes, the Roman warm, which are these spikes.
Mhm.
And then we call this entire time here the Holocene optimum,
Right.
which is the warmest time on Earth for the last 100,000 years.
Right.
Not today,
Right.
from around 6,000 to, let's say, 10,000 years ago was the warmest time on Earth in the last 100,000 years.
I mean, it's interesting too, if you just back up for 1 second, the model data, show in the model data would suggest that the Roman warm and the medieval warm were not as warm as today, which is a claim that's become very popular in the last couple of years to make. But like we said, the model data is not correct. The proxy data is.
Yeah, the model data doesn't even show a Roman warm at all or a medieval warm.
No, it does.
It's just flat here throughout the whole thing.
Oh,
There's
the
nothing,
model data. I'm sorry.
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
There's
I thought you
there's
were saying the
nothing
proxy data.
significant that goes on
Right.
in their model
But
data.
they still label it, right? So then that gives them the excuse to say, oh, well, yeah, there was a warm period, but it wasn't as warm as today.
So to simplify this, we can simplify the cycles by erasing the noise.
Mhm.
And that's what this chart represents. And the blue times are cold times on Earth. And we just had the coldest time since the last ice age. It was called the Little Ice Age.
Mhm.
So naturally, if you ask anyone on Earth, what happens after you achieve the coldest temperature in 100,000 years or in 10,000 years, what would happen at that moment? There's only one thing that can happen when you reach the bottom is you have to go up.
Mhm.
But none of these other times in the past when we went up significantly were any of them caused by humans.
Right.
But this one is.
Right. Right. That's exactly what I was saying about these news articles. It's funny too with the model data, right? Is the models are typically based on the idea that CO2 has a huge influence over temperature, as an example. And so it's completely circular reasoning, right? If you develop a model that is on that basis, then it'll look like your theory that CO2 controls temperature is correct. I mean, it's the definition of circular reasoning. It's absurd.
Okay, so let's take a look at 5950 to 5440. That's when the trees were alive. And then they must have got buried at 5440.
Mhm.
All right, let's take a look at the graph. Where did it go? Of course I lost it. So here is, what were the dates? 5900?
5950 to 5440, something like that.
So this is the time that the forest is growing. This spike right here, 59, these spikes, the forest is up high. It's one of the warmest times in all of the Holocene. These are only warmer times. There's 4 other spikes. So this is one of the top 5 warmest times for hundreds of years. And tree line rises, that forest grows, and then look what happens at 5400. This massive drop in temperature, the glaciers advance and they crush the forest, and then tree line is dropped. And apparently you could see the general trend here. The purple is obliquity, but that's also showing the trend of temperature down to the Little Ice Age. That forest has been continuously buried since this advanced in ice the entire time until today. You can talk now.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I've got you back. This is hard to navigate. Yeah, so I mean it's interesting too because the um immediacy of the drop off in temperature, the severity of that downslope, that also helps explain why we can see these forests now, right? That this cooling was very rapid. And so just, overtaken by glacier and immediately preserved. This wasn't really a slow process.
No, and drop downs of this magnitude are what end civilizations. The Roman
Right.
Empire ended from this drop down here, which is the same scale of drop down that buried that forest.
Right.
The Dark Ages began for this drop down here when everyone died, and it's the same scale of drop down that buried that forest. So these significant.
Yeah, and it's.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. It suggests something else too, which is that, the ability for civilizations to continue and survive in some respect has more to do with the severity of the drop off in temperature than the actual temperature range.
Yeah,
the Roman
the
warm
speed.
period is significantly colder than these periods in the boreal or the Atlantic, but obviously civilization was functioning just fine. It's the extreme drop off that really is destructive.
Right, and it's cyclic. So it's been happening the entire Holocene optimum. It was happening during the Holocene optimum throughout the entire 10,000 years. When we came out of the Ice Age, we've had these, what humanity considers major climate changes because it affects the way civilizations advance and decline. And if you look over here at the temperature range, we're only talking about 1.5 degree shifts.
Right.
Which seems insignificant.
Right.
But the alarmists are telling us that a 1.5 degree shift since the mini ice age is going to kill us all.
Right.
The only problem is it's the drop down, not the rise up. The rise up is what causes us to be amazing.
Right. We do well when it gets warmer, actually.
It's the exact opposite. We live in an opposite world, and people are just brainwashed. They have no idea what's up and what's down.
Yeah. I was thinking about this earlier because I was reading this other article about another forest that's been popping up from under Alaska's Mendenhall Glacier. And, of course, this is being used again to scream about anthropogenic global warming. But at the same time, there's another glacier, the Taku. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is. My apologies if I got it wrong. Which is in the same area. Is that glacier is advancing? It's doing the opposite of what the Mendenhall Glacier. So that's something else that the general public typically doesn't realize. That glaciers retreating and advancing is normal, and you can see it because both of these things are happening at the same time.
Yeah, and even more at the Mendenhall Glacier, which is 1,000-year-old buried forest. So let's come over and take a look at the graph here. What's happening 1,000 years ago? We enter the Little Ice Age. So we come off of the medieval warm, and this is when the Dark Ages begin. And so the Mendenhall Glacier was retreating for about 1,000 years, and the sedimentary evidence shows there's a rapid advance happening at this time that buried this forest. There's a several meter thick gravel layer, which shows outwash and is indicative of these pulses of glacial advancement. So, and then here on the temperature graph, we see a major drop, the largest drop in temperature for all of the Holocene.
Yeah.
That brought us into the Little Ice Age.
Yeah.
And Mendenhall was buried. And so how they're using this as evidence for anthropogenic global warming makes no sense. It proves that our entire past 10,000 years has been warmer than now.
Yeah. Well, it's like anything melting at all is immediately used as evidence, especially in media, because the average person just doesn't have any context for this about how glaciers behave. So, or the context of the longer history.
So here's the big problem with warming. If there is global warming and it's natural, and even if it's anthropogenic, which it's not, it is good for the earth. It brings more forests to higher elevations worldwide, and all it does is green the planet, which cleans our air and gives us more oxygen, for goodness sakes. You're froze up. Oh, dear. This is all Elon Musk's fault. I think he is throttling.
You back?
Yeah, you're back. I think Elon Musk is throttling our Starlink.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that too, if some of the bandwidth is being derailed to California.
So here you can see a picture of what's happening at the Mendenhall Glacier. As these ice caves form from the melting ice, there are literally trees that are still rooted in the ground as they were 1,000 years ago, perfectly preserved.
Awesome.
And this is not unique. This is not an old tree preserved. By the end of the show, we are going to show you 60,000-year-old cypresses that are still rooted in the ground at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico.
That's awesome.
So let's take a look at regional reconstructions for the Holocene. Much more realistic. Again, Proxy is black, and all of the model runs are in other colors. They really don't want you to know what the actual past was. They've literally just washed it out into a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely weird.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's a large group of scientists that call themselves climate scientists that believe this is insane.
Well, again, it's circular reasoning. If your model is based on, a CO2 controls temperature model, then that's the result you're going to get. Like, how is it that none of these people have thought about that? I don't. Or you have thought about it and you just continue to lie to yourself and to your fellow scientists and to the public? I don't get it.
So a really great paper, Holocene Climate Variability, Part A, which also leads you to Part B, came out in 2017. And if you want to bone up on natural climate variability, it's a great paper to read. I'm a sedimentologist, a stratigrapher is my background, which default makes me a paleoclimatologist. And I can tell you that every single rock unit I've looked at across the United States that's sedimentary, no matter what time period for the last, let's say, 600 million years, all show major climate variability that goes up and down like a yo-yo forever. It has never been calm, cool, and normal. Everything all the time has always been changing. And we can see it at different scales. If we look at an ice age graph, the shifts are huge. If we look at the Holocene, these little wiggles at just 1.5 C are huge for humanity. They're also huge for the biome. We just saw forests that used to be almost 1,000 feet higher that got crushed by glaciers. Can you imagine if we were alive 6,000 years ago, what the mountains were, how green they would have been?
Right.
There would have been trees all the way to the top of the mountains here.
Yeah.
It'd be weird.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, we have a ancient stand of 6,000-year-old trees on top of Square Top. They're from this period.
Right.
And they're still alive.
Yeah.
Because they haven't been covered by a glacier.
Right.
That's amazing.
I mean, one of the cool things about this too is it makes it clear that, there isn't exactly a defined edge to an ice age, right? It's just a gradual process in many respects. I mean, in the context of this graph, obviously you can see the extreme shifts in temperature, but you see in some places the remnants of an ice age, in other places you see the remnants of a warmer Holocene period, like in the case you were just talking about. So and it's the same with glaciers that are retreating and advancing at the same time. It's just all part of a longer process.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into the longer process now.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to start with the Younger Dryas event. So we've been looking at just this top part of the graph, which did not show this amazing rise in temperature of 15 degrees C. We're not talking Fahrenheit. That's more like 24 Fahrenheit. So we've got a 15 degree C rise out of the Ice Age, and we've been pretty much on this pattern. And you can see how cold it is right now today. It's the coldest time in the Holocene, and yet they claim we're burning up. It's complete lunacy. And you froze up, unfortunately. I'll keep talking. So we are going to discuss the buried forest of Manitowoc County. It was first discovered over 100 years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of what they describe in this paper is incorrect. I think they need to revisit this and do a little bit more better dating. Are you there? Thanks, Elon. All right, the forest is known as the Two Creeks Buried Forest. It was included in a television program about the history of the world back in the 1950s. And students from all over, including a guy from Ireland, made the trip to see the buried forest firsthand. One group of University of Wisconsin-Madison students came to the site and went back to the classroom with 27 different types of mosses, a pillage not likely to happen these days. So this Ice Age forest might date to the final glacial advance of the last ice age, or 13,500 years ago.
But I think the conclusion they came to that it was 11.4. The tree,
Yes.
the forest itself. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. When you last froze up for me, you were saying something about that the dating is incorrect on this.
Yeah, because they went from 13.5 to 11.4.
Right. Well, I think the 13.5 was, they said that it might date to the final glacial advance of the last great ice age, or about 13.5. So they weren't claiming that the trees were 13.5. They're just looking at the climate picture overall and saying it might date to this time. And then I think they eventually concluded that it was 11.4.
Which is interesting because if it is 11.4, what we need is we need a warm period for a forest to get there, and then we need it to be crushed by ice again and covered. And as we're trying to come out of the Younger Dryas here, there is a rapid cooling that occurs before we enter the Holocene. And this is dating right around 11.4.
Yeah, that's interesting.
This rise is 11.5. This drop 11.4. So the forest could be buried here in this little blip, which is not a little blip. This is bigger than any climate shift throughout the entire Holocene. So it's pretty significant.
But that would also mean that this forest potentially would have to also have survived the cold of the Younger Dryas.
I think that it might have just formed during this period, few hundred years of warming. It just shows up there.
Right.
The trees aren't that old. They're only 50-year-old trees. So all you need is 50 years for the forest to grow and then for it to be destroyed.
Right.
So the glaciers move away. They expose this flat, fertile plain. A forest comes up, and then they advance again for a short period and bury it.
Well, what's also interesting about that, too, is, obviously, if you have a forest spring up somewhere after there hasn't been one there for some, let's say, a couple hundred years, there is some seed that is being preserved for a long period of time underground. Now, you and I have witnessed this firsthand, right? When we dug our ponds, and all of a sudden at the bottom of these ponds, there is some kind of grass springing up that we don't have here. And it's 4 feet down?
Yeah, spontaneous cattails as well.
Right. So that's also very fascinating to think about the resilience of seeds being buried for extremely long periods of time. That's amazing.
Yeah. So if those forests were bowling Alarod, which is the warming prior to this, then the seeds would have been preserved for thousands of years, 2,000 to 3,000 years before exposed and growing again. But what also could be happening is because this is a fertile plain, you're going to have, and the way pine seeds get spread is they get eaten by animals and then excreted in the dung, which is like a fertilizer packet. So we might have had animals coming into these grasslands pooping out the seeds. Also, birds can move them. So there's lots of mechanisms to get an instant forest, which then gets obliterated. But
obviously that seed has to be somewhere relatively nearby for an animal to be moving it around, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. Yeah.
And the region we're talking about is on the glacial margin. So just to the south of here would have been amazing fertile lands filled with trees and animals. So the Two Creeks Buried Forest is pretty amazing, and I think we need to do a lot more study there. What else?
And I think they are continuing to do more study there, right? Because this is weathering out of basically the shoreline of Lake Michigan.
Right, which is a newer feature that would have been there at the end of this destruction. During the beginning of the Holocene, you would have had Lake Michigan form. So the lake must have been much shallower at this time and smaller. You're coming in and out. All right, let me turn off my video and see if that helps.
I'm sorry, I didn't care to.
Turn off your video and let's see if that helps. Are you there? Can you hear me? All right, we lost Leah. She's completely been lost. So we'll just keep going on here. We're going to jump into... Are you back?
I'm here.
All right. It just cut you off completely. You're gone from... I don't even have you as a guest.
I'm here.
I know. Just telling you what's going on.
Oh.
So the unveiling of an ancient underwater forest in Alabama. Let's talk about it. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right. What are your thoughts on the forest?
Oh, well, I find it absolutely fascinating. I mean, obviously, this certainly shows that sea level rises and falls accordingly with climate. I sort of recall reading that this was buried under, I guess, sand for a long period of time. Is that correct?
Yeah. So let me tell you the backstory here. There is a scuba diving company in Alabama, that has been scuba diving in the Gulf for multiple purposes, obviously to see fish and sharks, etc. Maybe even some wreck diving. And what happens in 2004 is Hurricane Ian moves across the Gulf of Mexico where they do their scuba diving. Shortly after Hurricane Ian, it's over, fishermen notice in this area offshore, it's many miles offshore, tens of miles offshore, that they're catching all these fish in an area they never caught fish before. So they asked the scuba divers to go out there and see what's different. So they go out, they dive down, and what they find is a riverbed with cypress tree stumps showing the river itself. And the cypress trunks and their knobs are all intact in the ground as if they were fresh. The only problem is they're under 60 plus feet of water.
Right. So
what happened was 60,000 years ago. Can you wrap your mind around it? If we go back 60,000 years ago, we are at the glacial maximum. This entire period from 70 to 58,000 years ago was a glacial maximum. This means sea level was very low compared to today. And so where we are here in the Gulf of Mexico, 20 miles offshore, was the actual shoreline for tens of thousands of years. These cypress forests flourished. And then look what happens on this graph. there is a vertical rise almost to the same level we are at the Holocene, almost an interstadial, and the sea level rises rapidly, probably tens of feet. And when you get a rapid rise like that, the coastal plain will inundate the forest, and it will cover it in exactly what you need to preserve it. Anoxic mud first, and then you cap it off with sand.
Right.
And so this was continuously buried for 60,000 years.
Right. And then it gets uncovered and it becomes like an instantaneous reef.
Accidentally uncovered by a hurricane.
Well, so that's the other thing here is now that it is uncovered, it's not going to be preserved any longer.
Right. It is going to eventually break down. But here is the beauty. If you want a waterproof, mildew-proof floor, do you know what the only product is that meets that spec?
Cypress.
Cypress. So these stumps are going to last, even though they're exposed to the water, probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the beautiful thing is that hundreds of scientists have now gone out to this site and are studying it. They're bringing up entire sections of trees and logs, and they're going, take a look at this wood. It's as fresh as any wood can be today.
That's amazing.
And this is an underwater picture of wood they just found.
Yeah.
60,000-year-old stumps.
Fascinating. I mean, it's not as impressive as what was it? The wooden structure that was uncovered like under a riverbed. What was that, like 200 million years ago or something? I can't ever remember the number. Are you there? Hello?
Are you talking about the wood structure in Zambia?
Yes.
That's 400,000.
400,000. What am I saying?
So you
Million?
can preserve wood much older than 60,000. That wood is 400,000 years old in Zambia. Just Google 400,000-year-old wood structure, Zambia. But I guarantee that wood is not going to last as long as this wood because it wasn't cypress.
Right.
In fact, as soon as wood that old is exposed to air, it rapidly deteriorates.
Right.
So there is a benefit to just leaving this stuff down in the ocean.
Right. Well, and the fact, I think that's what they did with the Zambia structure is they put it in water, back in water to preserve it.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of people that want to get their hands on this wood. You can imagine how much it would be worth.
Yeah.
They uncovered a 42,000-year-old kauri tree, remember, in New Zealand that showed the exact time the Lachamp excursion occurred?
Right.
I'm sure they're selling that wood.
Right.
So what does this tell us? First of all, scientists are amazed that this even exists, but what it shows us is that if we were to trace the ancient shoreline in the Gulf of Mexico, it's only in 60 foot of water. We could probably find artifacts of ancient cultures that were living in North America 60,000 years ago. See, the problem with finding people older than 13,000, the Clovis people, is that most of the evidence is buried under the ocean. People just don't get that.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's it's very convenient. I mean, and it's strange too that, you know, I don't know that this is happening in the United States, but there is the situation in India where there's ample evidence of civilization off the coast of India underwater. And apparently people have very difficult time getting permits from the government to actually scuba down and inspect these ruins. There's a brick wall preventing scientists from doing that. And it's like, why are you trying to hide this? Like, what is the agenda here? It's very bizarre. And I suppose that it is in part an unwillingness to acknowledge that our climate has been dramatically different than in the past than it is today. Because if we acknowledge that, then we can't really, it makes it very clear how screaming about anthropogenic global warming is, how silly that is now.
Agreed. More interesting is that these buried cities off the coast of India, they would have been happening right around the time of the Younger Dryas and slightly before, the same time of Göbekli Tepe, when sea level was rising and inundating these cities. So clearly they're trying to hide the fact that there was high civilization before the catastrophe.
Right. Well, we can't have people believing that people prior to us might have been more advanced than we are today.
Right. But what makes it worse is that if civilization existed during the sea level rise, let's say back in the Younger Dryas, and it's now inundated, that civilization was a high civilization. And it didn't just pop up at that time. It had to develop for thousands of years prior. And if we go back 20, 30,000 years, sea level is now 200 to 300 feet lower. And that means the evidence of that early high civilization will now be under 300 feet of the ocean, which is an impossible depth to go and look at.
Right. No wonder we can't find Atlantis.
Yeah, it's probably under 300 feet of water somewhere.
Right.
And buried in sediment that hasn't been washed away by a hurricane yet.
Right.
Or it's sitting offshore of India, some evidence, and it's illegal to go dive.
Right.
Which is what's happening there.
Right.
A lot of people think there's a conspiracy at Göbekli Tepe to prevent excavation. That's just a manufactured story. The problem is that there aren't thousands of archaeologists that are willing to do that work.
Right. And it's a huge complex. You know, what we've uncovered of Göbekli Tepe is quite small.
Right. And there's at least 12 other sites that are as large from the same time frame, all being excavated right now.
Right.
So these things take time. And with just a handful of archaeologists working out there, all of the information is going to just trickle down slowly year by year. But I think the veil is being lifted. If you guys want to know more about the underwater forest, there is a great 30-minute video called The Underwater Forest that is on YouTube and free to watch. It's also at www.thisisalabama.org/underwater forest. And it tells you all of the science of what's going on. And what I find interesting here is that not only is there evidence that their ancient shoreline 60,000 years ago was 20 miles offshore, there's also geologic evidence that this shoreline was also 100 miles onshore.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean.
There was a time 40 million years ago that there was no ice, sea level was so high that the current shoreline in Alabama was 100 miles north of where it currently is.
Right.
The same thing in New Jersey. If you're 80 miles inland and you're in the Raritan Creek, you're going to find shark teeth in the creek bed that are 40 million years old, which means the ocean was once there.
Right.
So this is showing us how highly variable the ocean can be.
Right.
But they're claiming anthropogenic global warming is going to bury all of the cities. They've been saying this for decades, and not a single inch of water has risen.
Right. It's funny too. In some of the media articles about Mendenhall Glacier, they'll claim that the local people there are very concerned about the sea level rise in the area. But when you look at the data, sea level has been falling slowly over since at least like 1920. So it's I mean, are they really concerned? Are they actually noticing it rising? I mean, they can't be, because the data is showing the opposite. If they're concerned about it, it's only because the media has been telling them is that it's been rising.
Exactly. And in fact, Alaska was recently covered with glacial ice about 13,000 years ago. And all of those northern areas that were covered in ice are still rising. It's called isostatic rebound.
Right.
So as the land rises, it appears as if sea level is falling.
Right.
But it's actually the land rising.
Right. The fact that there's no acknowledgement of that phenomena in the context of discussing sea level is completely absurd. You cannot have an intelligent conversation about sea level without talking about isostatic rebound and where it's happening.
Right. And there's not a single place on Earth where sea level is doing the same thing as another place.
Right.
In some places, the land is rising. Some places, the land is falling.
Right.
And yet they have a sea level graph showing a 3 millimeter per year rise for the last 150 years.
Right. It's like as if you were to use Venice to illustrate sea level rise without, that's the indication of everything that's happening around the globe, right? Because Venice has been sinking for decades.
Exactly.
It's absurd.
But if you go look at Plymouth Rock, it's still at sea level.
Right.
400 years later.
Right.
So where is the catastrophic sea level rise?
Right.
I'll tell you where it is. It's coming, and it has nothing to do with you.
Right. Exactly.
So typically when we exit the ice age, which is coming soon, or exit the interstadial, which is coming soon, and we drop back down into ice age, all the glacial ice will melt. So we're going to have something happen that melts the rest of the ice rapidly, except for Greenland and Antarctica, because it's too thick. And we'll have a Heinrich event. And then right after the Heinrich event, we'll go back into ice age.
Right.
So say what?
I was just reiterating what you were saying. The temperature will drop dramatically at that point.
Yeah, whatever the Heinrich event is, and no one knows. But what occurs is ice rafts down all the way to the mid-latitudes, which means there'll be icebergs offshore of North Carolina.
And then they'll claim that that's evidence of global warming.
Of course, but then we'll go into an ice age. But maybe that'll be after Uncle Bill blocks out the sun, and then he'll claim victory.
Well, that's what I think. That's what I've been hypothesizing for at least the last 5 years is, if you are actually aware of the real data and the silence, I don't believe that Bill Gates buys into all of this global warming BS. I think he probably knows at least vaguely what the truth is, but if you block out the sun and it gets cold, then like you said, you can claim victory over global warming. Oh, I solved it. When in reality, doing so is going to make things far worse for humanity if you start spraying things into the atmosphere to block out the sun. I mean, I don't really believe that he's actually going to achieve that. Just that it's even being entertained is insane.
I agree. Here's the fuzzy ice age epocha data, and we're about to get more. If this epocha is about to not end at 800, it's going to go all the way back to 1.2 million. So we may glean some insight into why we went from a 40,000 year ice age cycle to a 100,000 year cycle. We still don't know what this mechanism is, but it is so overpowering when you look at this data set that no amount of anthropogenic cow farts is going to prevent what happens next. And it's a rapid drop down into ice age for the next 80,000 years. That is coming. It's coming anytime now. But because of a human lifespan, it might miss us. But future generations will live through it.
Right.
That is, if the AI doesn't take over and there's a robot war in about 6 years.
I mean, we may see little drips and drabs of the drop-off beginning, right? But it won't necessarily be super evident to people. And, of course, it doesn't help when you have the media claiming that things like, cold and snow are somehow a function of global warming.
Well, everything is a function of global warming.
Right.
Right? It's racist. It's racisms.
Right.
And don't fret, because even we're in the depths of the ice age. Take a looky here. For the entire 80,000 years, there are little blips of warmth where you can get stuff done, but then that all gets crushed after the next event.
Right.
If we knew what was driving this 14 degrees C up and down, I think we would have a real good grip on what is controlling the climate on Earth. And if it is the sun, it means the sun is highly variable, has episodic and periodic outbursts, gets warm and gets cold in a nested hierarchy of cycles that change. Here we have, for the last 500,000, it's a 100,000 year cycle. Prior to that, it's a 40,000 year cycle. What is driving this? Because it's driving me crazy.
Well, not only has the length of the cycle changed, but the extremity of the cycle has changed. The highs in the 40,000 year cycle period are much lower than the highs are now in the 100,000 year cycle.
Interesting. And more interesting is that the 100,000 year cycle corresponds to modern man.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Interesting.
So maybe the Anunnaki came here 440,000 years ago, genetically modified us, adjusted the moon and Jupiter into a new position, and we had a new cycle form. What do you think?
I don't know about the Anunnaki part, but maybe Jupiter and the moon.
Yeah, there might have been a celestial shift back here.
Right. That's what I'm thinking.
A large body comes into the solar system, mixes things up, and we've got a new pattern.
Right. I think that could be the perfect explanation. It's probably the simplest explanation.
Yeah.
Because you're changing all of the sort of Newtonian dynamics of the system when you throw another body in there. So perhaps, our orbit has changed in some respect as a result of that, and then that has changed the cycle on Earth.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
There may be no other explanation but that.
Right. I mean, if it's not that, then it has to be something from outside our solar system that's, let's say, impacting our sun.
Yeah, if the variable star is its variability shifts because of some galactic wave, then it is a shift in the galactic wave. But what shifted the galactic wave 440,000 years ago?
Right. And the only way to answer these questions is to somehow, preserve all of the data and all of the knowledge that we have today for like another 400,000 years, so that somebody in the future can take that data and look at this all together and see the very large pattern that is so far outside of our lifetimes. And I want to believe, anyway, it may not be correct, that places like Göbekli Tepe were an effort to do such a thing, to preserve the knowledge that was available to people at the time for future generations.
Yeah, I'm sure the people that built Göbekli Tepe were well aware of the precession of the equinoxes and had a higher knowledge of cosmology than we do today.
Well, and it seems that many civilizations had an understanding of the precession of the equinoxes. That's been shown again and again. And, it's not like you pointed out recently that this isn't about deciding when the right time to plant your corn is. It's much bigger than that. We've been watching the skies forever, for an important reason, to find our place in the universe and understand what these cycles are.
Great show. I loved it back in the day when all of our gods were planets.
Yeah. They probably still are.
Magnetic Reversal News, 8 p.m. out time.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio.